Battle of Midway, the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the devastating air raids on Henderson and Wewak. Documentaries will always tell you about the big battles, about the numbers game, about the dozens of American carriers and thousands of aircraft that outnumbered, outperformed and outfought the Japanese during World War II. Did you ever ask yourself the question, how did the US sustain this force? How did they keep all the planes flying? And how did they manage to go from one bloody battle to bloody battle and somehow just get stronger and stronger? The documentaries won't tell you, but I will. Welcome to Military Aviation History. Our longtime partner, the Naval Institute Press, is sponsoring this video. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, the US Navy operated 7 carriers and 1 escort carrier, with a force of roughly 600 aircraft. Not half bad, that is certainly impressive. But the force had one significant problem, based on the interwar legacy. The logistic and maintenance support infrastructure was completely inadequate. In short, the Navy had the planes to fly, but no one to keep them flying. There weren't enough units, stockpiles or trained technicians available. And while the force had been gearing up for a looming conflict, the expansion of training and logistic capacities to provide a support structure was slow off the mark. Until about 1939, most formal training centers operated on a shoestring, and even the use of reservists didn't hide the fact that the fleet was heavily deficient on maintainers, repair specialists and instructors. As Fisher tells us in his recent book, Sustaining the Carrier War, acquiring more pilots and aircraft had traditionally drawn the most attention from lawmakers and Navy leadership. Acquiring and training more enlisted technicians was not a regular point of contention. One would be hard-pressed to find anything more than a cursory note in the recommendation section of the Chief of Bureau annual report to the Secretary of the Navy prior to 1939 that simply said, "Provide required increases in naval personnel to support the expansion program." The Navy, on the sea, was fully staffed, but on land, where the actual logistic and maintenance support happens, even for the Navy, it was barely making due. In 1939, it had about 66% of the personnel it required, and it lacked the facilities to maintain, repair and overhaul the required number of airframes and engines. When you look at the truly breathtaking scale of the US Navy expansion, you can start to see why anything but a major investment in support capabilities would be detrimental to the emerging US fast carrier doctrine. For example, in December 41, the Navy had about 500 to 600 aircraft over 8 carriers. This not just more than doubled in a year, but by the end of 1943, the force had increased tenfold and continued to grow. The more planes you have, the more people, technical units, maintenance facilities and spare parts you need. Actually, this is America. I have to get back to the spare parts at some point during this video. But for now, let's break this down together. In general, provided there is nothing broken on the machine, an aircraft was slotted for an inspection every roughly 30 flight hours at this point in time. That means it is taken off the operational roster and given a checkup. Before that is done, it ain't flying again. Then you have an overhaul, a thorough checkup where a lot of key components are replaced. It's again linked to flight hours, but in peacetime, just before the war started, on average it would take place every 18 months. And you can't do it on the carrier, it's a Class A overhaul, it must go back to a shore-based facility. Now in wartime, flight hours go up very quickly. Let's take an F-6F Hellcat with an overhaul requirement of 500 flight hours. Now say a sortie lasts on average 3 hours. Let's do some quick maths here. That gives you about 160 something sorties before you actually have to do your overhaul. Take an average of 15 flights a month. That's 45 hours a month. That's 11 months to the major overhaul. And you don't just have that with one aircraft, but hundreds that are going through this cycle in parallel, alongside, of course, minor repairs and maintenance before they even get through the overhaul. Unless you want your planes to gather dust, a grounded plane is a useless plane, you better invest in repair and maintenance capacity. As you can imagine, a ship the size of a carrier with the requirements of autonomous operation will have some maintenance facilities on board. While initially the embarked squadrons would come with their own support crews, eventually carriers were given what was known as either the CAS-D or the CAST. I really don't know how they said Carrier Aircraft Service Division back then. Specifically, the Engineering Division, V2, provided the men for direct maintenance and repairs, workshops for more elaborate component repairs, and then there was a storeroom with a specialized storekeeper to supply spare parts. There had also been some forward thinking, which is good because military strategy is build strategy. For example, Ranger, laid down in 1934, had only a storage space enough for a 10% stock of spare parts. By the time that Wasp was built, the allocated storage capacity was up to 50% for spare parts. Now, these organizational and construction changes provided carriers with autonomy to do their own maintenance and repair on board. But this isn't enough because a carrier is still fundamentally limited in terms of space and facilities. Just moving aircraft, in fact, from one end to a carrier to another is actually already quite an undertaking, especially if you're at full capacity. And you don't want to have a non-operational plane on a carrier. It's just wasting space. And this is where the CASU or CASU came into play. The Carrier Aircraft Service Units were a major change in the capacities of the Navy to take planes off a carrier and work on them on land, thus freeing up space on the actual carrier. Now, the carriers could focus on flight-related tasks and minor maintenance and repairs, while the complex stuff was, to use a 21st century term, outsourced. Dozens of CASUs of various sizes were established, and they were so successful that they even started helping the Army Air Corps, or Army Air Force, and Allied aircraft. The CASUs were mobile units that could be quickly stood up in one area and then quickly transferred to another as ground forces secured small islands across the Pacific. Its primary task was to maintain and repair carrier aircraft, but it was not meant to, nor equipped, to complete major overhauls. The overhaul part was still a problem. Yes, the situation by end of 1942 got better in terms of maintaining an ever-increasing number of aircraft, but you still needed to overhaul airframes and engines. You couldn't ship everything back to Pearl Harbor or stateside. So in summer 1943, the first Navy Aviation Repair and Overhaul Unit was set up. I believe it is pronounced ARU, maybe Arrow? Anyway, it's a self-sufficient unit for the assembly and repair of Navy aircraft, plus to provide engine overhaul facilities. I mean, check this out, right? Just one of the larger ones, Arrow 5, made over 2,700 engine overhauls in theater. That's 2,700 engines that can keep aircraft flying, and this was done pretty much in proximity to where the aircraft was stationed. And it is about to get even better because, well, first of all, side note, honestly, logistic and maintenance, it is so important. We talk about how many ships either side has, how many planes there are, how many aces. None of that matters if they can't be put into service and then kept in the fight. So, as you know, I like to give my sources with all videos, and this book, Stan Fisher's Sustaining the Carrier War, which came out recently, is an absolute gem of the topic. Like I said, fresh off the press this year. If you want a book to understand how important this topic is, or between us, prove to someone who is obsessed with the kinetic part of war, you have to convince them, then get this book. And if that isn't enough of an endorsement, you can currently get it at 25% off because it is of course published by our official partner, the United States Naval Institute Press. Use my exclusive code to get yourself a fantastic source at a bargain price. And do also check out my official reading list for more book recommendations from the Naval Institute Press. And I don't think I have to say this again, but the code is good for the entire Naval Institute Press's book catalog, and it is valid all year round. Like, write it down somewhere and use it whenever you get books. 25% off. Books. Yeehaw! Anyway, I promised it was going to get better, and it does. Did you ever hear of the assembly and repair vessels? Yeah, the Americans built amphibious workshops to support the island hopping campaign. Imagine this, you have a Japanese-held island, the US Navy comes by, it bombs and bombards the island, then the US Marines land, they do their thing, and then the LSTs land and drop off supplies, and then a rudimentary airstrip is built, and now 2 ARVs land. One provides immediate airframe repair and maintenance, and the other one does the same thing for engines. Yeah, they're literally landing on the beach doing these repairs. The ARVs are like first responders. Once the airstrip is improved and a CASU is set up, the ARVs pack up and do the same thing again on the next island. The Navy only had 4 of these, operating in teams of 2, but come on, this is logistics on steroids. And I haven't even talked about the escort carriers yet, that were often designated transport to ferry aircraft between the overhaul and repair facilities and the actual carriers in the theater. Then we come to summer 1944. It is estimated that for every 90 aircraft a carrier had, it needed to replace 16 each month to sustain operational numbers. Luckily for the Navy, by now the American industry was churning out so many aircraft that a very interesting shift occurred. For the first 2.5 years of the war, the investment into maintenance and logistics had kept the Navy flying. Now, however, the carriers were spoiled for choice. By 1944, it was easier to just exchange damaged airplanes with replacements in order to keep the carrier's air group at full strength. With so many spare airplanes available, the Navy could simply offload aircraft that were not mission capable and replace them with the ones awaiting delivery from a local CASU. In essence, US naval aviation transitioned to a throwaway culture in the last phase of the war due to the abundance of available replacement aircraft. Consider economics now. With the F-6F Hellcat, the Navy could have either ordered 2 Hellcats complete with a full set of spare parts for them and 1 spare engine a plane, or they would order 3 Hellcats with no spare parts for the exact same price. And if we take the Essex-class nominal loadout, we can see that since it is war and the Navy still hadn't used the money it was given, building more planes instead of making more spare parts actually started to make sense, especially as the value of a plane in operation was basically used up after a year and it made no point maintaining it anymore. At that point, economical overhaul and repair is useless. So what do? Yeah, you order more planes and less spare parts. In 1941, the Navy's carrier force was dressed to impress, but it did not really have any depth. It had to be economical with the force deployment, and you can see that also in the operations, and any major repairs and overhauls were a significant drain on combat mass. 2 years later, an expansion in logistics, maintenance, technicians, and facilities built the Navy into a flexible system that suited its carrier doctrine by keeping the planes in the sky when it mattered most. And then come 44, the Navy could support its air groups liberally wherever it went and supply a constant stream of replacements that instantaneously or near instantaneously filled any gap left by operational losses or the repair and overhaul requirements. And that's a pretty cool story. Now, big thank you here to all the supporters and channel members for making this channel possible. Also, do make sure to check out the discount code via the Naval Institute Press to get yourself this book from Stan Fisher and any other that you might want to read. I have an official reading list there with recommendations as well. Do check that out. And as always, I wish all you legends a great day and see you in the sky.